is really the art and science of turning fiction into fact.
Sometimes kind of real architectural life interferes with intellectual architectural life.
There is no such thing as architecture.
Hello everyone, this is Vikram Prakash and you are listening to Architecture Talk. Each week we try and have a conversation with a contemporary thinker on issues of architecture and architectural thinking. And what we are trying to do is expand, reinterpret, and reformulate what architecture is today, what it has been in the past, and what it might be in the future. Today I'm talking to my good friend Shundana Yusaf, who is faculty at the University of Utah, and who very recently has put together one of our GAHTC modules entitled Technologies of Movement and Communication. She did this in collaboration with her colleagues, Peter Christensen, Mrinalini Rajgopalan, and Itohan Osayemwiz. And I pick up the conversation with her in trying to understand why a module on technologies of communication would help us better understand and better teach and better know what a global history of architecture would be. Here we go. Welcome to Architecture Talk, Shundana. I have some of the slides of this pretty extensive module that you and your colleagues have put up as part of the GAHTC collective efforts. And I wanted to get into your motivations and desires about it. I'm looking at the table of contents of the module, and what you're doing is you're looking at ships, you're looking at horses, you're looking at camels, you're looking at road systems, you're looking at wheels, you're looking at writing, you're looking at theaters, eventually railways, tourism, photography, electricity. I mean, such an amazing, bewildering array of materials. And I'm going to ask you in a moment the question of what is the thinking behind all this. But first, we're going to get to the question of teaching in the United States. But I want to precede that by asking you the question of, well, you and I both are from South Asia, and you're from Pakistan, from a predominantly Muslim country, and a woman, and you have made the case of being recognized as a kind of a, if you want, feminist practice. And I want to ask you the question of what are the threads that connect your personal narrative to the investment that you have in this module? Are there any threads that connect your biography to the intellectual contentions of this module?
Absolutely. So I come from the part of Pakistan which is on the border of Afghanistan, which today is called Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. But I've been born and raised there. I've traveled across the world, but I've still kind of like my moral compass really comes from that part of the world and how it intersects with my training in the West. And one of the biggest challenge for me was that my education in architecture in Pakistan, in National College of Arts in Lahore, as well as in the US, which was at Harvard University, MIT, and Princeton, in all places, has been in schools of architecture. And in schools of architecture, I have never, ever been able, before the work that I did for GHTC, to find a language to think about the built environment from which I come out of. So I live in a part.
So describe us that area you come from a little bit more.
So the area that I come from is now the part of Pakistan which has the old Gandharan civilizations. I'm from a rural community. I've grown up in the cities, but I have a very strong connection to our land, to our villages, which we go regularly to when I'm in Pakistan, and which is Pashto speaking. So it has a lot of Afghan refugees. This is the part of Pakistan that is really threatened by the Taliban. So it's a very unsettled kind of place right now. It's very volatile.
So it's on the northern part, where the active border between Afghanistan and Pakistan?
The Durand Line line that's the active border between Afghanistan and Pakistan. And so most of the bombing, we are the victims of most of the bombing. So my parents don't live in the city anymore where I was raised in Peshawar.
A lot of drone attacks over there, I suppose.
A lot of drone attacks, not in this part of the province, but actually the tribal areas that border between Afghanistan and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa.
Did you feel threatened growing up?
Not growing up. The things in this part of Pakistan really became bad in 2008 when I was in New York already. So I was already an adult and already finishing my PhD at that time. But right now, like, I feel that it's a real tragedy that I now am trying to work on that part of the world. And it's really, really difficult to do any work there. It's difficult to have access to archives. It is difficult to travel in that area. It is difficult to get visas. It's difficult to get grants.
Help us get into your module. Tell us, what is the core concept behind organizing material in this way, which is quite different, obviously, from how the other modules are organized on GAHTC, which are, let's say, mostly generally chronological or have a specific area of study. You and your team have organized these by this diversity of topics. Can you introduce us to the elements of the module, and then let's get into sort of its core concept?
So the modules actually are organized around technologies of globalization.
Technology of globalization, technologies of movement and communication.
So technologies of globalization, in which we have focused on two types of technology. One is the technology of movement across space and time, and the other is technology of transportation, so physical movement of objects, people, ideas, and things, and materials. And interest in this comes from the fact that actually my dissertation and my PhD training, which comes from Princeton is the place where most of the focus is on media studies in architecture. So I come from kind of a media studies background, but before GHTC, I was already thinking about the way that I would organize a world history survey or a global history survey is to think about all the technologies that from the beginning of time to present have been the connective tissue across space and time. And then my three colleagues who work with me and who made this possible, because there's no way that one person can do such an ambitious project, all of us work on globalization. Mina Rajgopalan works on Delhi. She is looking at the connective tissue of Delhi that connects it to the globe, whether to the West. Peter Christensen, he is looking at railways, Ottoman railways, transatlantic railways from Germany all the way to Siberia. And then Ituhan, actually at Brown, she looks at the relationship between Germany and African colonialism. So all of us come from globalization. Some of us work on infrastructure, some of work on feminism, some of work on post-colonialism. So the idea was that once I said, let's think about the technologies of globalization and do a history of technologies, then we decided, okay, what technologies have been influential? And then we realized that was the most amazing way to get out of kind of Eurocentric attitudes to architecture.
I see.
And so it was not only that we were after getting out of Eurocentrism, that was the least of our problems. We also wanted to get out of the traditional ways of nationalist histories, the traditional manner of doing history of religion, history of empires. So you will see that the same technology, and then you realize that globalization doesn't begin with, for example, railways or the ships, but it begins with much earlier. Like we start with pre-typographic orality. I wrote this lecture on horses as an earlier technology of globalization that began 3,500 years ago.
Right.
And we discovered two things, very interesting, that when you start looking as the history of architecture from the perspective of technology, you also overcome another huge problem: the dichotomy between vernacular and monumental architecture, the dichotomy between settlement societies and nomadic societies. And so it undoes all the traditional categories of analysis that we have in architectural history. And I think it is because architectural history has always been written from the perspective of sedentary societies. It has been always written from the perspective of written societies. It has always been written from the perspective of men. It has always been written from the perspective of power and from the center to periphery. This undoes all those things.
Okay, but let me stop you here 1 second. So let's talk a little bit more about that. I mean, you are saying it undoes the binary, let's say, between settled and nomadic architecture.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it seems to me, I'm looking at your 2 lectures on the horse and on the camel.
Mm-hmm.
Why wouldn't you say that it offers a perspective that is from the perspective of the nomadic worldview, much more so than from the settled worldview? How does it undo it?
It undoes it because, for example, the camel is an excellent case study, because the camel makes, even though it is technology that the nomads had, the entire North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, as well as Middle Eastern countries that are around the Mediterranean Sea, none of the caravan cities, for example, which are part of the settled societies, do not exist without them having access to relationship to the nomads. So it is about relationships rather than one perspective versus another perspective.
You are arguing in, let's say, the Camel lecture that there is a constitutive interdependence or constitutive or fundamental relationship between the more nomadic forms of architecture and the more settled forms of architecture. Is that the argument?
That would be one of the underlying arguments, right? So the camel produces monumental architecture. For example, Petra is a good example. Kaaba, Mecca, which was a caravan city, trade city, and existed not around the horse so much at that time, but really around the invention of the saddle, the Southern Arabian saddle.
Mm-hmm.
Really Islam, right? Islam doesn't exist without the superiority of the technology that camel offered over roads that the Romans had put not out in Saudi Arabia, but in the regions around it. And the mentality that each technology brings is radically different than one another. A good example would be that horse cultures and camel cultures are, as opposed to cultures which are road dependent, which we consider quote unquote more civilized, are actually cultures which don't require large governance, right? So because you don't require large infrastructure, you do require a lot of landscape intelligence. So you need to know where the water sources are in the desert. You need to know where the oases are, and you need to be able to study the stars. So you're actually quite scientifically prone. It's not that you don't have a science, you just have a different type of science. Whereas roads are dependent on kind of large governance structures. So you can retain tribal systems even today in parts of Mongolia, in parts of Niger, in parts of Mali.
I see.
And so I think the distinction between Islam and Christianity, or between this empire and that empire, are not good evaluative categories, because each category reveals certain things and hide other things. And I feel that we have found this super productive to undo some of the challenges that we've had in architectural history as a discipline.
Let's say that looking at it through the lens of what you're calling technologies offers us the opportunity to move away from the settled categories of national identities, regional identities, empire-based centric identities, and so on. So talk to me about the implications of this new perspective you've talked a little bit about how it helps us rethink civilizational models, as for instance, the systems of governance you just talked about. But talk to me a little bit more about the implications of this kind of worldview on architectural thinking, which is to say, on the constitutive fundamentals of, let's say, I suppose, what is architecture?
I think the most important, the most exciting revelation at the moment that has happened to me in the study of technologies of globalization as a framework for thinking about architectural history is because I teach in architectural schools, and I insist that architectural education today is very much a colonial enterprise. Architectural education today is model of modernity, which is from the Western perspective, white male notion of the profession. When we look at a technology across space and time, for example, we look at the invention of wheel. Wheel does not emerge in the West, but actually in Central Asia and in Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and then it moves towards China, it moves towards India, it moves towards Europe, all the way to England and actually North Africa, and you'll realize, and then in this sub-Saharan Africa, there's no wheel, right, till the 19th century. So what we find, because they don't need it, they have camels, wheels are for idiots, according to them, because they're too technologically demanding. And so they have smarter technologies, I would say. So you realize that the cultural superiority of the moderns, right, is undone in this. What is really amazing in this kind of spatial history, what I'm calling, which is kind of horizontal thinking, as opposed to vertical thinking, thinking about just China or thinking about one case study, but you're doing these kind of now really crazy comparisons between Roman hippodromes, and then you're looking at Vishnu's temples in India, which are two different notions of time that are produced by how wheel is incorporated into their architectural practices. What happens is that you realize that modern way of thinking today is one form of thinking among many alternative ways about thinking about reality, about truth, about man's relationship to nature, man's relationship to man, women's relationship to children. So there are all these alternative models that now we don't have to think about, oh, this is culturally and civilizationally superior, which is what we teach till now, have been teaching in architectural school, that everything moves towards this kind of 19th, 20th century concrete and steel architecture. And then you realize that that's actually not true. There are many different forms of realities, of modernities that exist. And camels and goats and horses and all those are part of it.
So give me an example specifically of a possibility of making and thinking architecture today that derives from some of these alternate worldviews which are not Euro-modernist.
So I'm going to go back to the lecture on Camel, and I'm right now writing a lecture on early written architecture of the early written societies. And we have usually historically considered camels as a backward technology of barbarians and of these nomadic Arabs who are all, and usually today from the modern perspective, we say, oh, these are misogynistic, male-dominating societies, and look at the West, how we want to make everybody enlightened like us. Let's educate them in the Western academic model, right? So let's bring them into architecture schools. But when I wrote about the camels, I realized that camels produce this very lightweight, mobile architecture of the tent, the Arabian tent and the African tents, or the mat tents. And all of these tents are produced by women. They are women's architecture. Most of them are owned by women. Most of them are created by women, from the shaving the hair of the camel all the way to actually turning it into the fabric from the tent, from erecting the tent, from flattening the tent, right? So even though these are very male-dominated Muslim societies, they, at the same time, if you look from this perspective, there is tremendous agency within all its confines that women have as producers of architecture.
So would you argue that a modern feminist reading of architecture could be produced through the architecture of tents?
I have found, I didn't go looking for it. I don't do feminist history, but I found that, right? Then, when I'm writing right now about the history or architecture of the written society, that has been considered like writing begins history, and everything which is non-written societies are considered prehistory. Right? So that's the dividing line, which now luckily people are augmenting. But I realize that all the written societies, writing is the handmaiden of power. So it is tied to cities. And cities are tied to the enslavement of village worlds, and it is tied to the emergence of universities, which are always male-dominated institutions. Like I just wrote about Taxila, which is first a Hindu university and then institution, and then it becomes a Buddhist institution. And you realize that these are all male-centric, power-dominated civilizational projects where writing is actually more masculine as opposed to the production of tents, right? So it undoes these categories for us.
So what is a contemporary tent derivative architecture?
This is what I'm saying, that now there is very little part of the world that is left, right? Because I think the question that you asked is an oxymoron. That is not even possible, I would say. Because for women today to become modern architects, we have to male ourselves and whiten ourselves, right? Look at you and me. We are both from South Asia, but we're speaking in English, right? Because that is all of our educated architectural audience. We reach a much larger audience if we speak in English, right? So what has happened is that our consciousness has been not only westernized and mailed in the architectural profession. Architectural history, I'm not putting it in the same category because I think architectural history is a different beast than architectural practice.
Do you think there's any difference between the International Space Station and container ships? I mean, I look at the International Space Station and I think, wow, this is what nomadism possibly can look like in the 21st, 22nd century. And I look at container ships and I say, well, they are sort of nomadism which has been taken over and completely normalized.
These are two entirely contradictory and I would say mutually exclusive forms of nomadism, right? So the ship, for example, or the tent, right? The women build tent, whether it is today the Bakhtiari tent or the Lari tent in Iran, or whether it is the Toreg tent in North Africa. Those are actually the relationship to nature, to energy, to environment, entirely different than a modern nomadic spaceship, or in which a relationship to nature has become completely exploitative. So I would say it would be dangerous to do a kind of an equivalence between them. If I would say to take the category of nomadism, yes, I can make an argument about, oh, okay, so this was nomadism yesterday and this is nomadism today. A car would be an excellent example, right? A trailer park or like a camping gear that we use. Mm-hmm. But in all of these, we have a kind of a relationship to nature is exploitative. We have dominated nature. Now I'm sounding a little bit like Heidegger, and I don't want to do that. But nevertheless, we bring forth the qualities of nature and we work with the properties of nature. So there's radically different issues at par over here. So one of the things that I do in my lecture on the camels is that I end the lecture by talking about the fate of camel in a carbon economy, and I give the example of the intelligence of the Black Arabian tent as opposed to the intelligence that we find in the Jeddah terminal that SOM built, which has won a lot of architectural projects, right? But you look at the mockery that it makes, this postmodern kind of mockery that it makes of the idea of travel, right? So there's no camel travel, it's now aeroplane travel. And then these are air-conditioned spaces. The narrative of power is so different in those that I think that you can only talk about that it becomes an image and it becomes a style. And that is because modernity is intolerant to any other form of existence.
On the other hand, one can argue that the entire sort of relationship to nature and the articulation of women's voices and women's worlds are very contemporary, alive discourses. Ecology and sustainability and living in a sympathetic manner with the natural systems of the world is the religion of the profession today, whether or not they profess it, right?
Yes.
And so is it not possible to find new pathways opening up which can connect the Bedouin tent to contemporary ecological thinking?
I would say that contemporary ecological thinking, as long as it wants to recalibrate the relationship to nature, it is still doing it not by, we can't return to the economy that or the social structures or the cosmological beliefs that made the older tent possible, right? What we do is we have an instrumental relationship to these things. So the contemporary ecological thinking is still very instrumental in its nature. When it comes to the level of policy, the only way that you can convince a certain corporation or a certain business or even architects, because architects are no more enlightened than anybody else, they do the same things that they, okay, if you can show that this reduces your client's electricity bill, or this makes it possible for you to be able to live in Death Valley, then architects are open to those things. So I think that there's a kind of a radically different relationship to knowledge today, which is intolerant to other forms of knowledge. That's my kind of concern right now.
Right. Okay. And that's still a project which is in the making. All right. All right. That'll be a good point, perhaps, for us to take a break. We are talking to Shundana Yusaf, who, with her colleagues Mrinalini Itohan and Peter Christensen, has put together a module on technologies of movement and communication for the GAHTC. We'll be right back. Hello, everyone. Thanks for listening to Architecture Talk. We release a new conversation every other Wednesday. So, if you're enjoying this conversation, please do be sure to visit our website and to check out some of the earlier conversations. From the website, you can also subscribe to this podcast and you can listen to the other episodes. You can also simply directly subscribe to us via Spotify or via the podcast app. And of course, we are available to be heard via any of the other podcasting apps that are available on the internet, such as Stitcher, Overcast, etc. We would also love to hear from you if you have any questions or just some comments, or even have a suggestion for a future episode. You can reach us via the contacts page on architecturetalk.org. Thank you for listening again. Hello and welcome back. We are talking to Shundana Yusaf and we are discussing the GAHTC module on technologies of movement and communication. So, Shundana, I have your lecture 4 open in front of me, which is this fascinating discussion of the horse and how the horse has played this critical role for a long time, from about 5,000 years ago. Although the horse has been around for a very long time, it took us 20, 30,000 years to kind of domesticate the horse. And in this module, your team and you have spoken about how the ability to move swiftly on the horse enabled military advantages, enabled movement advantages, enabled a kind of a relationship to landscape, distance, and transportation, which is of course quite unique, and which, as we know from the numerous occasions on which the cultures of the Russian steppes has interacted with the Central Asian cultures has been a pivotal thing in Eurasian, Euro-African history, particularly the story of the Mongols much later, which also is covered in this lecture. I was fascinated and really drawn in to the slides that you have put in of the burials of these, I presume, noblemen and women buried alongside their horses. In these cultures of, for lack of a better word, nomadism and their relationship to the horse, how do you articulate the institution and the architecture of burial? And I want you to connect this to ideas of death, which you have a complete slide on. I think it's slide 24. There's a slide called Death in Early Horse Cultures, in which your team talks about how death was imagined as a place that was cold, swampy, underground realm that one traveled to. And I think over here of Greek and Roman culture and their notions of Hades and hell, and I suppose it connects in some ways to Egyptian, certainly Chinese, and possibly pharaonic Egyptian concepts of death. So can you talk to me a little bit about, how death, with its eternal mooring to stasis, interacts with the general culture of nomadism, and how you think that possibly underlies or runs up against other notions of death, which are generally associated with more settled cultures?
Yes. So again, because the prism through which we look at every culture and every technology is architecture, I recognize that what was happening was that early nomadic cultures don't have any architecture of the living because they would live in these yurts. They would have either gurs or yurts. It's the same thing. But so that their houses, their everyday architecture has not survived. So what we have is two things from horse cultures. One is contemporary yurts, which, based on the archaeological information, drawings, diagrams that we have found either on pottery or something from early horse cultures, that we realize that they looked very much like the gurs and yurts today. But the architecture, the monuments that they have left us are basically graves. Right? So they're called kurgans in general. That's one word for them, but they go by many different words. And then I realized, it's because only in death is there a kind of a break from that kind of movement, right? So in this culture, that is when you become sedentary. When you die, right? And so their early graves were basically just the oldest ones that we found in the Eurasian steppes are very flat kind of spaces which were just marked by a few stones in the grassland. Then we see them rising a little bit. And in the end, third stage emerges when we have steles, right? Which is actually a Greek word, but these are like representations of some kind of images of the people who were buried inside them, which were always nobility or chieftains. But the fourth thing is that actually the kurgan becomes like an artificial mountain. It's not that you put a grave on top of a mountain, but so there's a huge mobilization of land and earth to create an artificial mound where in these flatlands, right, which don't have mountains themselves. You can see that as the architecture is changing over these 2000 or 1500 years, that is happening when this is from small tribal societies. They are moving, they are now sitting on top of the horse, right? So the minute you sit on top of the horse, you become richer. How do you become richer? Because now one person can attend to a larger flock of sheep and goats because you have a high point. And the minute you can do that, you begin to become territorial. So you need larger grasslands. And so now you need both cooperation amongst people and now as well as this kind of rivalry between competing tribes. So you move from tribal loyalties to these militaries, and you can literally see the kind of tribal people becoming empires. So, but what happens is that the cosmology that is attached to, or the ideas that are attached to death is not considered as a kind of the idea of heaven and hell that you have not only in Greek, and actually the Egyptians don't have that. The Egyptians have another idea of returning into the ground, which is the waters, and then they go up into the sun and they're going to come back in another form. So they have a kind of this idea of cyclical time and the earth sitting on water, right? Whereas these people have this idea of return to land and as a journey, and that you put all your worldly goods, you put your horses, you put your gold, and these are really rich societies, you can see that. But what very soon happens is that because these then become landmarks, right? They mark the landscape. These also become the sites for the living. So inside a lot of these kurgans, you will see over time, you have places where the living have their festivals of birth, of the marking the death anniversary of someone, of religious festivals. And that is where they realized they could make beer or malt and different types of fermentation. So they would now go around and come back to these once a year. So they now started marking landscapes. So they became part of the life of the living.
They become sort of markers in the landscape, sort of permanent, more static markers in the landscape, right?
But they also become community centers.
I mean, there's an interesting sort of dualism between movement and nomadism and status over here, right?
And what happens is that if you look at in Christianity and it's in Islam and Buddhism, you would see this idea of the mound. And now that I'm actually also looking at the Mayan cultures, this idea of the pyramid temple, there are so many overlaps that you can see that these are global ideas, which are courtesy of the domestication of horse.
I see.
So you see that sometimes architecture and ideas move, this idea of the stupa as a pile. Then the Muslims have like the grave is never flat, it's always marked by a small mound, but the idea that the way you distinguish yourself from the shaman cultures around early Islamic societies is that you don't bury anything of this world in there, right? So they are making these distinctions because they're defining themselves against an existing tradition.
Right. Yeah. So Islam sort of distinguishes itself in that way.
Even when it takes many of its ideas, right?
Sure. But some of these sort of core epistemic concepts have to be distinguished to introduce abstraction.
Exactly. So the thing that I want to make an argument is that even when form looks alike, the function and its meaning are radically different.
Right.
But what I want to say, bringing it back to the GAHTC thing, that what GAHTC has enabled me to do is to find a language in which I can talk about the mud architecture in my area together with the Afghan refugee tents, together with the stupas that are littered in our villages, right? Like literally my parents who live in the city but who have a house on the land, when we go there, it is very often that a farmer would be digging a piece of property in which he's trying to build a basement, and they discovered some kind of coins or that are Gandharan, right? So it's very, very common, like for us to be the recipients, because people don't know what to do with those things. They think they are infidels or whatever. So.
Right. I mean, it's true. Yeah. I mean, your master's thesis and even some ways, I suppose, your PhD, both are very, it's on the radio cultures of England and topics like that, as are mine. To a certain extent, I suppose these mine is on Corbusier.
Yeah.
So these are both topics which help us gain access to the Western Academy.
So it helps us get access to the Western Academy because the Western Academy does not have a language to train us. Like, for example, my educational system, and I have had very good faculty members who have been invested in what I wanted to study, but I felt that I did not have the intellectual apparatus or the language in which I could connect the contemporaneousness of the rural world that I come from to a place like Princeton or Harvard or MIT.
So do you think GAHTC is unique?
GAHTC has been, I would say, the tunnel that has connected me to say we can compare these. This is, I don't no longer in talking about the rest of the world have to talk about modernity versus tradition. This is another form of modernity. I don't have to ghettoize my knowledge, which is the biggest challenge in schools of architecture. Because if I was in humanities, if I was in an art history program or a history department, I would have no problem in remaining in a ghetto because ghettos are valued there. But in architecture school, there is no way that I would have been able to bring this kind of knowledge at power, right, in a comparative analysis to a Le Corbusier or Delirious New York. I would have not been able to compare the weave-in practices of women builders of the Al-Murrah Black Tent in southern Arabia with techniques of design and making prefabrication screens for the Herzog and de Moran structures, right? Now I can do this.
So now you are teaching in a school of architecture in Utah. Does teaching global history feel completely anomalous? Is it a challenge, or is it because you are in the Southwest, which has fascinating American lineage? How does the teaching of global history working for you now that you are on the teaching side?
And I actually came to GHTC because I had straight from the East Coast. I had come to the University of Utah, which had hired me to teach an early world history, so before Renaissance. So this was like an arranged marriage that was forced on me, and I just have now completely fallen in love with the idea of arranged marriages because this worked for me, right? Because it worked for me. Because what happened was when I came here and started teaching world history, I realized, I can now develop a language in which I can put these very clashing ideas at par with one another. Right? So that was one thing. But what has happened is that in our universities, especially in schools of architecture, and I see this over and over again, there are two types of schools of architecture, two major models, if I can be very simplistic about it. One is the schools of architecture that have completely decided they're going to go the digital route. They're going to do sexy architecture. They're going to make beautiful blobs. And there's a kind of a nihilism in that everything is arbitrary. And so it doesn't matter where you begin from. So your project can go anywhere. And then there are other schools of architecture. I'm very lucky to be in a school which is really committed to social engagement, committed to producing architecture that is humble, that is small scale. We don't do sexy projects. So our school is not sexy in that sense. So we are invested in these things. So there is a commitment in our school to producing students as global activists and actors. Now, the problem is that other than the history courses that we teach and the theory courses that we teach, the whole responsibility of the ethical training or globalizing the mind of the students only falls on history courses. And there's a firewall between the lecture room and the rest of the school outside of it. Because when they go into the studio, even though they're very well-meaning studios, the studios travel abroad, we do community engage, we do design build. These are all well-intentioned approaches to it. But I think that we need to pluralize, or we need to have the language that we have developed in the HTC, which means history theory courses or lectures, needs to be extended into the studios, into our structures courses, into our building technologies, into our sustainability courses. Because at the moment, what is happening is that, yes, we teach this global relationship to the world and architecture in the history courses. But when we go to a structure class, we teach as if Western form of structures is the only form of structures that exist.
And only the last 20 years, really, or 20, 30 years, only modern Western in that.
And so modernity as a kind of, there's an inevitability. Nobody is saying this, but there is a subliminal message that we are the subtext of everything that we teach the students outside of the HTC courses, is that West is still the only game in town.
And the modern West.
Oh, yeah, exactly. So the modern West. And so we teach only the study of cities. We don't teach them the relationship between cities and village worlds that exist today. I mean, Utah has a plurality of building environments and communities. We have native communities. We have native communities with a written text. We have native communities that are still oral communities. We have small, still very 19th century type of small towns. We have still mining industry from as if we are in some other twilight zone. So we have big copper industry. So we have all these competing realities, these different registers of reality that coexist over here. So any state, if we open ourselves to this, we can see that we have anything that I'm teaching you on any part of the world. An example of that, a parallel to that still exists, that we're suffocating out of existence because we want to modernize it. So the Navajo Nation, we think that the way to build on Navajo Nation is to give them more buildings like our own, to make them like us, to extend kind of the charity, philanthropic architectural practices. So the architecture of 1% should be given to the 99%. Rather than the 99% defining or challenging the architecture of the 1% and augmenting it and broadening its horizons. So there's no lateral learning that is happening.
Right. Well, it's been a pleasure talking to you, Shundana. Thank you for being on Architecture Talk.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for listening to Architecture Talk. This is Vikram Prakash. I am the host of the show, and our show's producer is Elizabeth Umbenhauer. If you like the show, please do remember to subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. And also take a moment and rate us on iTunes. Thank you very much, and see you next time.